Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're excited to share the third webinar in our series, Maximizing Federal Investments for Young Children. I'm Jen Bender with the Build Initiative, and I'm handling the logistics on today's call. Audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer speakers. Please ensure your speakers are turned to a comfortable volume. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please type them into the chat box found in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. The presenters will monitor the chat box and provide responses as they are able or following the call. At the conclusion of this webinar, you'll be redirected to a survey. We encourage you to take a moment to provide feedback about this webinar so that we may improve. This webinar is being recorded, and tomorrow morning you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording and the PowerPoint. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Harriet Dichter.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really happy to have the opportunity to have a focus on kindergarten with everyone today. And as we get started, I just want to remind people about our sponsor for today's webinar, which is the Build Initiative. Build has been working over a long period of time now to engage with state leaders and community leaders to ensure that we have a comprehensive, equitable system in place that will really meet the needs of young children and their families. And the idea behind Build's systems building approach is to focus on what matters most, our children, at the same time doing that with a careful conservation and cultivation of both our public and our private resources. This is the third in our series on maximizing federal investments for young children. We are trying to take a look at how people and states are leveraging federal resources to advance their own vision and systems for serving young children and their families. Today, our focus is on kindergarten. I have a few things I want to share with everyone about kindergarten assessment, and then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll hear from them. As most of you know, there was a federal competition to create new kindergarten assessments, and the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge also stimulated this work. This webinar started with exploring how some of the states that have been participating in this work are doing. At the same time, we are also aware that states working on assessment have been expanding their view about kindergarten assessment and trying to take a different, more whole child, whole classroom approach. That's important because we know that kindergarten assessment is very prevalent in our classrooms. Here are some interesting data for you to consider. 34 states have either statutory or regulatory requirements for kindergarten entrance assessment. 17 states have fully implemented a kindergarten entrance assessment. 13 do not have one, and there are others in progress. More significantly, perhaps, across the United States as a whole, 73% of all kindergarten classrooms are conducting kindergarten assessment. There is a detailed study using data from the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study that shows that kindergarten assessment is being used in urban, rural, and suburban schools and with children of all socioeconomic backgrounds. We also know what people are saying is the purpose of their assessment, and here's what we can say about this work around the country. States that are working on kindergarten assessment do not have a single purpose in approaching their assessment. These are the purposes that we know are occurring throughout the states. 1, understanding and reporting school readiness at kindergarten entrance. 2, improving kindergarten instruction and practice. 3, supporting the transition of children into kindergarten. 4th, starting the assessment continuum for K-12. 5th, identifying children who need further evaluation and intervention services. And 6th, in some places, informing decisions about class placement, delayed entry, or early entry. For those states with a statutory or regulatory requirement, most appear to have adopted a comprehensive approach to kindergarten assessment, including key domains of child development that go beyond language, literacy, and cognition, and embrace social, emotional, and other critical aspects of early childhood development and learning. 93% of the schools implementing kindergarten assessment report using that assessment to improve kindergarten instruction and practice. But schools are also, again, using assessments for one or more of these purposes related to enrollment. 41% of schools are saying that they are using these in part to determine class placement, 24% to advise parents about delayed entry, and 16% to determine eligibility for students whose age fell below the cutoff. As a general matter, a kindergarten assessment could have more than one purpose. 50% of schools using the assessments do report both instructional and enrollment-related purposes. 60% use their assessments for both instructional purposes and screening to identify additional testing needs. And in discussion with state and other leaders, they think it is valuable to use the kindergarten assessment to elevate a system-level understanding of the important contribution of quality early learning in the years before kindergarten to kindergarten readiness, but see this as a secondary purpose to improving kindergarten instruction and practice. One last data point. 16 states that are implementing a kindergarten entrance assessment are using a commercially developed tool as part of their KEA. 3-state consortium, and we'll hear from some today, funded through a federal assessment grant, are developing measures to be used. 13 states have developed their own KEA, sometimes in conjunction with a commercially made tool. For the most part, again, it appears that the tools span multiple domains of child development and use observation and children's ongoing work to inform the assessment. So state leaders are seeing KEA as an entrance point into better support for kindergarten, and I think you'll hear that on today's webinar. We are also better understanding that the work on kindergarten is a partnership, of course, between local teachers, schools, the state, and families, and you'll hear about this on the call along with the efforts to engage families and improve professional support for kindergarten teachers. With all of this background in mind, I'd like to introduce our speakers, and then we'll be hearing from them. We have a really wonderful group of speakers with us today. Let me say a few words about them so we can get started. Vincent Costanza is the recently appointed Chief Academic Officer for Teaching Strategies, which many of you know as the creator of TSI Gold, the Child Observation and Assessment System. Prior to joining Teaching Strategies, Vincent worked for the state of New Jersey, where he led many important initiatives. Most relevant to today's session was his work to support kindergarten through a whole child, whole teacher approach, which he'll be talking about. Vincent is also active nationally, serving as a board member at NEYC, among other things. Next, I'd like to introduce Kimberly Harshaw. Kimberly joins us from North Carolina, where she is a kindergarten teacher and was previously a pre-K teacher. She is also very active in the work to support the innovative work that North Carolina is doing on formative assessment in kindergarten. She participated in the pilot phase of the North Carolina K-3 formative assessment process, and she is a member of her school district's implementation team. Next, I'll be introducing Lizette Rodriguez. She works in New Jersey in the Western New York School District. Yes, that is part of New Jersey. She is originally trained as a school psychologist, and she is now an early childhood supervisor in that district. In her current role, she supports teachers in the implementation of the New Jersey KEA and the kindergarten guidelines by focusing on the classroom environment and developmentally appropriate practice. She has been part of this work since 2015. Our final speaker today will be Megan Scott, who joins us from Oklahoma, where she is program coordinator for the Oklahoma Partnership for School Readiness, the State Advisory Council for Early Childhood. She is focusing on the coordination and implementation of the state kindergarten entrance assessment, as well as work on early childhood integrated data. And of course, I am self-introduced. I'm Harriet Victor, and I'm the moderator for our session today, and I myself have a big history of working on these issues. I want to thank all of our panelists in advance, and what we've done for today's setup is that each of our speakers will present. Then we'll take questions after each of them. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and when we get to the end of each segment, we'll take some of those and then move on. Vincent will serve as our first speaker, so I'd like to turn things over to him now.
Great. Thanks so much, Harriet. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So to all the participants who receive services through BUILD, you're obviously in good hands with Harriet and the BUILD team. As Harriet mentioned, I was a state administrator, and when I served in that capacity as a state administrator in New Jersey, BUILD and Harriet were always on my short list of people I needed to speak with as I navigated my own problems of practice related to assessment or system building. As Harriet mentioned, I currently serve in the capacity of Chief Academic Officer at Teaching Strategies. I've been at Teaching Strategies since July. Prior to that work, I was in the seats that many of you sit in on this call, serving as the Executive Director of Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, and Administrator of the Division of Early Childhood Education and Family Engagement with the Department of Education in New Jersey, which had oversight of all birth to third grade programs through the Department of Education. And I worked on many of the same problems of practice regarding formative assessment, kindergarten entry assessment, and best early learning practices that many of you on the call worked through. I'm also joined by Lizette Rodriguez, who is an early childhood supervisor in West New York, again, also still in New Jersey. Although many people on this call would certainly align with the vision that is up on this slide right now, it's actually much easier said than done, certainly, and requires that there's different attention paid to different levels. You'll hear about some steps that are needed to implement the vision that's up on this slide from Lizette. An important takeaway here is that partnership is essential. On the state level, you cannot do this work without strong district partnerships. And without question, Lizette and the folks of West New York were among the strongest that we had in the state. So why are partnerships so important to this work? For one, we do this work at a time when you might have noticed there are many initiatives that are going on, and all of the initiatives don't seem to all fit together in a very cohesive manner. Teachers working with 0 to 4 population are implementing QRIS, new standards, going back to school, all while not earning a worthy wage. Teachers working with 5 to 8-year-olds are implementing KEA, state standards, teacher eval systems, all without a clear sense of how any of these initiatives benefit the lives of young children. To us, the secret lay in our ability to create coherence among these seemingly incompatible or seemingly competing initiatives. As the slide indicates, there's a lack of clarity and coherence in our field. However, at this point in the development of our field, there's no question that this lack of clarity and coherence exists. While the disjointed elements of our field have been discussed ad nauseum long before this 2015 report came out to synthesize things that we have talked about for a long time. These things have been talked about for a long time, but often the results of this disjointedness gets short shrift. So what are some of the results? Has anyone on this call ever heard a teacher say that kindergarten feels like the new first grade? Has anybody else on this call said that interacted with a teacher that says preschool is really a repurposed kindergarten? If you haven't heard those things, you haven't been talking to enough educators in our field, because certainly everybody has heard teachers say something along the lines of that. For administrators, the lack of coherence is no easier, as creating a common curricular and assessment language is impossible without such coherence. Furthermore, good luck with your family engagement strategies if what you have to offer are fragmented approaches throughout the grades. Certainly, much has been discussed about difficulties in preschool to kindergarten transitions, but the issues stand when transitioning from first grade to second grade, from second grade to third grade if approaches are wildly different or grossly inappropriate. And certainly if we're looking to make connections throughout the school system, as a father with a daughter in middle school, those transitions are kind of important too. And if there's not a coherent system in how a school system aligns those transition practices, it really looks pretty crazy to parents and children alike. So then the question becomes, well, how do you go about clarifying this picture, which is really what's of essence here. Throughout the school system, but in particular for our work here within a K-3 school system. We saw our work as touching these 4 elements on the slide. We thought about building capacity. In what ways can we make this effort collaborative? How can we focus on pedagogy? And how can we align systems? Here I'll pull from the work of Michael Fullen. Surely there are other frames that can be used. However, the simplicity of the approach is what I find so appealing and powerful. Of course, I'm reminded that simple is not to be confused with easy, as this work is far from easy, but in the elements that you could find simplicity, certainly you should be focused on that. The argument here is that without a focus on system-wide coherence, you may see instances of good practice, you may see particular cases of appropriate assessment, you may find pockets of aligned curricula and pedagogy, but those efforts will necessarily be thwarted due to a lack of sticking power that comes when coherence is intentionally planned for. I'll briefly discuss how we thought about these coherence building elements at the state level when designing our KEA system. I'll pause to hear some of your questions, and then I'll turn it over to Lizette, who will give you a view from one of our strong partner districts. So here is how we went about, or here are some examples of the system in New Jersey and how we approached capacity building. Really 2 major elements. One is that professional learning occurred prior to the school year, and 2 is that there were relevant professional development experiences for both teachers and administrators in the nuts and bolts of the KEA system. We had done this work long enough, we had worked with enough teachers to know that teachers were saying they would love to teach in ways that we wanted them to teach in, but they had administrators who just weren't supporting them. We had worked with enough administrators to know that administrators felt like they wanted to do this work, but they just felt like the teachers weren't in a spot that they needed to be in to actually do it. So really what we needed to do was to focus on both at the same time and be talking to teachers and administrators and start off first with how do we build capacity of both of these very important positions of teachers and administrators, and focus on all of the educators who we need to focus on. So here you see offerings for teachers and for administrators just in the nuts and bolts of the tool itself. Then we needed to really think about, in a state like New Jersey that had 644 school districts, they still have 644 school districts, we could not just have a one-size-fits-all approach. So here's an example from New Jersey of how we approached collaboration and differentiation through our rollout. Key elements are 3 things: flexibility, scaffolding, and continued use of the tool. After piloting for 2 years, we learned that implementing the entire tool, which is what we asked teachers to do in the first 2 years, was just too much. As a former kindergarten teacher myself, I learned how to be a good listener and knew that continuing that approach would not be good. So it was just too much. Again, as a former kindergarten teacher, I thought about, in conjunction with the teachers who were implementing, what is really on the minds of kindergarten teachers at the beginning of the year. From our perspective, it's literacy, math, and social emotional learning. We aim to provide a solution that would benefit the lives of educators participating in the initiative and allowed flexibility with elements for implementation. Since we were not experts of all of the local districts, we allowed districts to implement in ways that made sense for their particular context. So this allowed districts to have the option of full district participation or more targeted participation. So in some districts, The entire district would have 65 classrooms participating, 65 teachers. Other districts, they said, we have a lot going on right now. We're going to start and build capacity with a couple of champion teachers and then roll out in subsequent years. Again, we had an expertise in the things that we wanted in the early learning principles, but we weren't the experts of local context, and we needed to work in true partnership to help us to roll the initiative out with meaning. The other thing that was important, here are some examples of the system in New Jersey and how we focused on pedagogy. Although we provided professional learning in the tool prior to the start of the year, we knew such learning wasn't enough. What was needed was professional development that assisted educators, teachers, and administrators with focusing on best practices and problems of practice. Here, we were fortunate to learn from many states that came before us in trying to do this work. Some of the early KEA work was focused almost exclusively on collecting data on children. However, our theory of action here was that you need to engage the different levels of the system simultaneously and focus on teaching, learning, and best practices. And really, without that work, you weren't going to see the changes that you needed to see. And what's interesting about that to us is if you think about making connections throughout, and in subsequent years of use, teachers focus on cognitive areas of development, focus on persistence and problem solving and things like that. If you think about, as our field continues the efforts to make greater connections with the early learning elementary and primary years, I find the expectations that we have of high schoolers to be particularly relevant here. Just a sample from the Career Ready practices, of which I highlighted 5, and they're all important for preparing young adults for the world they will enter when they leave school. So unless you think it's a good idea to wait until children are 14 to be able to work in teams, think critically, create, innovate, communicate, then spending large chunks of the day in whole group settings simply won't cut it for practices, and certainly if you're trying to do formative assessment, performance-based assessment, kindergarten entry assessment, or any kind of curricular embedded assessment, you just will not be able to do that well and use those data to inform instruction unless you really focus on teaching practices. So while I presented what I presented here represents our state level thinking, I want to turn it over to Lizette. And actually, before I turn it over to Lizette, I'll pause and entertain any questions that you have for me.
This is Harriet. So if people have questions right now for Vincent, the way to share them with the group is to chat them and to input them into the chat box. And then we can respond to them now. And if people don't have questions now, that's okay. We can keep going and hear a little bit more details about things on the ground in New Jersey.
So having given the appropriate wait time there, I think it sounds great to turn it over to my colleague from New Jersey, Lizette, and she'll give you a deep down view of some of the ways that they implemented some of the state thinking in true partnership, and they were really doing some innovative practices in West New York, and Lizette will take it away.
Thank you, Vincent and Harriet, for allowing me the opportunity to share West New York's experience with the NJKEA initiative. I would like to take this time to walk you all through our district's planning and support of our teachers and administrators. The best place to walk you through this is to start by the bottom and really look at our central office leadership. It really was the vision of our superintendent, Clara Herrera, that led the way to our full participation in this initiative. She recognized the need for improved developmentally appropriate practices in our kindergarten classrooms. Our superintendent was committed 100% to creating student-centered classrooms that fostered the 4 C's, the creativity, communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. With her leadership, she committed to do the following. Our district had full district participation. All 35 of our kindergarten teachers participated in the NJKEA. Gold was the only assessment tool used with the kindergarten students. This was a huge endorsement and acknowledgement to the teachers' efforts because it really minimized all other distractions and removed practices that were not necessarily aligned with this new vision for the district. Gold became the focus and the driving agent for change. Also, workbooks were not ordered for the kindergarten students, and use of worksheets and dittos were discouraged. Our early childhood supervisors and our bilingual supervisors attended the kindergarten seminars along with our kindergarten teachers. The superintendent also ensured that all central office administrators, principals, vice principals, and K-12 supervisors participated in our kickoff meeting in which she and Dr. Costanza shared the goals and visions for our participation in NJKEA. This was particularly important because all administrative staff, even those at the high school level, had the opportunity to listen to the shared vision for early childhood practices that were able to reflect on how those practices are still influential at the grade level. As Vincent mentioned, we shouldn't wait until high school in order to begin to think about these connections that are important to the K-3 transition and also beyond. It's also important that all of our administrators are familiar with the overall goal and vision for the district, that everyone understands what developmentally appropriate practices look like in order to engage teachers in meaningful conversations about their experiences and challenges. Recently, the Study for Child Care Employment out of Berkeley released a study, Early Childhood Preparation for School Leaders, Lessons from New Jersey Principal Certification Programs. This report looks at principal certification programs in New Jersey, where the state's pre-K program is a national model for high-quality pre-K. There were key findings and recommendations to improve the preparation and ongoing professional development for elementary principals in New Jersey and nationally. This study stems from the idea that principals in elementary schools with pre-K programs are responsible for understanding what high-quality early learning looks like and fostering a school culture that values early education and supports early educators. Unfortunately, it is common for elementary school principals to enter this role with limited or no formal training in early education or child development. Across the country, most principal certification programs do not provide instruction focused on children prior to kindergarten. Principals need to be more than just managerial leaders and also need to focus on being educational and curriculum leaders. As a result, here in West New York, there was a focus on providing administrators with professional development on best practices. Our goal really was for everyone to begin to speak the same language and to articulate the district vision. Our administrators attended the Gold 2-day administrator training that Vincent had mentioned. The KEA manager came and spoke to all the principals and central office staff about highlights from the kindergarten seminars. In particular, the classroom environment, schedules, the right balance of academic rigor. These were all good conversations to have with our administrative staff. Also, K-12 supervisors met with the early childhood supervisors on additional goal training. All administrators were invited to the professional development provided by the master teachers. Principals formed their own PLC groups and met monthly to discuss relevant topics, and also supervisors met periodically to discuss the integration of literacy, math, curriculum as they relate to the GOLD assessment tool. Really, all of these practices help to build the leaders' understanding and to go a little bit deeper into their learning. But perhaps the most effective strategy to deepen their understanding of developmentally appropriate practice was the classroom walkthroughs with the early childhood supervisors and master teachers. I had the opportunity to conduct walkthroughs with the administrators that focused on the classroom environment. We used a kindergarten classroom environmental photo checklist that was developed in conjunction with our master teachers in order to have a visual guide to assist our walkthroughs. This resource was very helpful because we were able to go center by center with the administrators and easily identify elements that should be in a classroom. It truly made post-observation meetings more meaningful by guiding what do you see questions. This checklist served as a conversation starter really with the administrators, and it gave them a tool to be able to conduct future walkthroughs independently and to really have reflective conversations with their teachers. Once we completed the kindergarten walkthroughs, we then went ahead and did some first through second grade walkthroughs using the first through third grade guidelines. So as we launched our initiative and listened to the teachers' concerns, we quickly realized that we needed a plan of action. This is really an overwhelming time for the teachers as they tried to navigate new assessment tools, changes in their everyday teaching practice, and as I mentioned earlier, gold became the focus and the driving agent for change. We quickly learned that teachers were struggling with gold because their classroom environment did not align with developmentally appropriate practices. As teachers struggled, they needed a specific plan to get through them. A teacher that has a classroom set up in rows that uses dittos and predominantly teaches in whole group will struggle with the use of the gold assessment tool. So to achieve success, we needed to develop a systematic plan to tackle the classroom environment. After all, the classroom environment is a silent teacher that drives the everyday experiences of the students. We needed to take the strategies and ideas presented at the kindergarten seminars and adjust them to fit our district and make it the West New York way. This focus on the classroom environment led us to develop a plan to roll out a model kindergarten classroom in every elementary school. We worked as a team with the building administrators and all the kindergarten teachers in the building to select a teacher for the model classroom. Once selected, we continued work as a team as we progressed through the specific steps and timelines. Our idea was to break down this huge task into smaller, more achievable tasks. This would encourage success and build collaboration. We had 2 master teachers assigned to this initiative, and their supports and resources were instrumental in guiding the change and culture. Together, we began step 1, which was to focus on our environment. We conducted a classroom inventory, did before and after pictures in order to identify materials needed to create the centers. We had a kickoff meeting during prep times and CPT times with the teachers to discuss the implementation and the rollout of our timeline. We also had additional meetings with the kindergarten teachers to review the kindergarten guidelines. We wanted to make sure we were all on the same page, speaking the same language to review expectations for arranging the classroom environment. We also planned a visit to a pre-K classroom, which was very important to do the connection between pre-K and kindergarten. We gave them visual resources so they were able to go into the classrooms to see what are the important elements of centers. We also gave them questions so that they can ask reflective questions about what are some ideas that should be in the centers. How does a teacher enhance a center with math and literacy activities? We also did preliminary walkthroughs in the model classroom with the supervisor, the master teachers, and sometimes even the administrators in order to lay out a sketch for their classroom. The following year, in 2017, or I should say we ended that year with a meeting with a focus group of kindergarten teachers because it's really important to gain their insights and their thoughts and plan together as a team for the year ahead. And in the following year, we continued our work with the master teachers on the classroom environment. We worked on getting materials in the classroom. We also worked on different strategies to enhance all of the learning centers. A second step in our rollout, one that was very important as well, was to deepen the teachers' understanding of best practices. Oops, sorry, went too fast there. Our focus on teaching environment led to the development of several professional development opportunities for the kindergarten teachers. I worked with 2 master teachers that presented workshops and conducted PLCs to enhance the teachers' knowledge base. We provided examples of high-quality centers that allow for choice time. We planned for literacy workshops. We planned for assessment workshops. We planned also for conversations regarding project-based learning. As far as the gold assessment, it was very important to have conversations, reflective conversations, about the types of documentations that the teachers should be entering, what are they assigning their preliminary ratings, the quality and the richness of the evidence collected. Also the variety of their documentation. We also realized that when you move from a whole classroom, whole group to small group, the teachers need opportunities for classroom management. They need opportunities to have boards and know how they need to run their classrooms throughout the day with varying schedules and activities. This really has been a very enriching process for us here at West New York, and we're very excited with all of the work and accomplishments that we have done. As we start in year 3 and we do our walkthroughs, it is very exciting to see the success of the teachers and how their classroom environments have changed, but more importantly, how the everyday experiences for the students have changed. Any questions for me?
So Lizette, this is Harriet. We have a couple of questions in the chat box for you and I think for Vincent to respond to. The first of those is to talk more about vertical planning with preschool class and linkages, basically additional information on preschool linkages for kindergarten assessment.
Sure. So for us in West New York, it was important to have that vertical articulation between pre-K and kindergarten. Our pre-K teachers here also are using the GOLD assessment. So those were great conversations to have. And also because we're modeling our kindergarten classrooms based on centers, and our pre-K program does that very well. So it was a good opportunity for us to pair up our kindergarten teachers with our pre-K teachers, do walkthroughs of their classrooms, and have conversations around what our best practices. And we hope to continue that as the year goes on this year in having greater PLCs around the GOLD assessment itself.
That's great. So another question that Bobby Burnham has really has to do with the issues around giving flexibility around elements of GOLD to implement, and to hear whether you had any challenges there, particularly on data quality or data robustness, and then also whether you have information you can share about what people elected to focus upon when they were given that kind of flexibility and choice.
So this is Vincent. It might be maybe Lizette, I could take a swing first, and if you jump in there, because for us on the state level, the flexibility was really kind of calling card of how we rolled out the approach. It was funny because we would I would jokingly say that this was a voluntary and funded initiative. And I think I was the only person in the Department of Education that got to say that, because usually everything is involuntary and unfunded, so you just have to do it and there's no money for it. We knew that we had, again, an expertise in early learning principles, but we weren't the experts of just the very diverse and variety of districts that were there. We also knew that if we were concerned about data quality and we didn't focus on instruction, what we were going to be getting back was not going to be good data anyway. So although there were some states that took an approach to limit or select particular items within the tool, we chose not to do that. Instead, what we chose to do is to use full domains, and the ones that we used, again, were the ones that we felt as educators, and what we heard from educators as well, what was on their minds at the beginning of a kindergarten year: literacy, math, and social emotional learning. And the teachers used the entire domain, all of the items within those 3 domains. Now, there were every teacher passed inter-rater reliability before They did a final rating. So we felt good about the data that we collected. We did not run out to report on data in a big way because we knew that first what we needed to do was really focus on classroom practices and then start to link data in that way. So that's how I would address Bobby's question and ones around data. I think an important linkage there is to the lesson that Lizette is talking about, and I think one of the important things that Lizette has to share, the West New York approach around doing walkthroughs was so important to their quality implementation because they needed to have administrators, principals in buildings in particular, kind of normed and to have a lens on what quality early learning looked like. That report that Lizette mentioned, the UC Berkeley study, which I would be happy to share with everybody as well if that would be of benefit, was a study that we did in New Jersey, an evaluation of the principal certification granting programs in New Jersey to look at the coursework that principals were getting. And we know that anecdotally and now from this report that there is no early learning training for principals as they get their principal certification. That's all well good, but what do you do with principals who are there already? And Lizette, I think, talks very effectively about an approach that helps to solve that problem of not having principals who know much about early learning. Lizette, anything to add to that?
Well, I think as far as the quality and richness of the evidence that the teachers collect takes time. In the beginning, what drives the change is the classroom practices. As the teachers begin to change their classroom environment, they find that they're able to easily collect data. For example, a lot of our teachers struggled with social emotional collections because it wasn't an area that they used to focus on. So with time and training and good reflective conversations, the quality will improve. And most importantly, over time, teachers will begin to use that data to really drive their instruction, and really that is the goal of our participation in this initiative, is to have that data drive your everyday instruction.
Thank you to both of you for responding to those questions. I think we will now move on and we'll get to hear about North Carolina from Kimberly now. And I do want to urge people to just do what happened during the first piece we had on New Jersey. If you have questions, something to share, just type it into the chat box. Kimberly, it's all yours.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Harshaw, kindergarten teacher at Pathways Elementary, and I'm a teacher that is very passionate about the KEA and the benefits of implementing this process in my classroom. All of our schools across the state of North Carolina are now implementing the kindergarten entry assessment in order to capture knowledge and skills of our students during the first 60 days of school. Now, this process has helped in gaining an ongoing understanding of the strengths and needs of our students as they enter kindergarten and transition from a variety of early childhood settings. Now, the benefits I've found through this is that it is a whole child approach and it is strengths-based. I am looking for what students know and focusing on that instead of focusing on what they haven't learned yet. The KEA is ongoing and is a valuable process for us to continue all year. We gather information on all of the children in all 5 areas, in all 5 domains of learning, which includes emotional literacy and fine motor, which is the whole child approach. And we don't just look at areas such as math and reading and writing. And after determining that required learning status, I continue to use formative assessment to inform my instruction and to meet the students' needs throughout the remainder of the year. Now, what we've learned through this process is that, yes, KEA is formative assessment, whereas so much focus in the past had been put on summative assessments. And in a nutshell, I have the ability to capture information in the moment. I'm providing learning opportunities every day where my students are actively engaged in developmentally appropriate activities. I can write anecdotal notes, take pictures of what the child is doing, and talk and share with them and involve them in their own learning. So not only do I make ongoing adjustments to instruction during the first 60 days, but I keep doing that throughout the school year and based on the individual student. And this is all done while learning is taking place. It's not during an isolated event, and it can take place throughout the whole school. It might be the cafeteria, the playground, walking in line, going to the buses, and it's just become a part of our normal school day. And this process also allows for me to involve, like I said, involve the students in the conversations I'm having and involve them in setting their learning targets and realizing where they are in their learning. So in my classroom, what that may look like is me working with a small group or individual child and sharing the data that I'm collecting or letting them know why I'm taking a picture or letting them take their own picture and just showing them on the progression where they are. And we set learning goals and talk about where they need to go next. And it's just good to see my students get excited when they feel like they've reached their goals and they want me to know and they want to share it with other students in the class. And the support tool includes a technology component. Like I said, I could take picture or video of the students in action. So during the first few months of school, my students aren't aware that I'm formally assessing them, because I am observing them while they are engaged, or I'm just collecting their work samples, their drawings or their writings. And as the year progresses, they often come to me and ask if they can take their own picture if I'm too busy to come take a picture, or if they can use my device to video other students that are working. So they get involved with this process. And like I said, it just becomes a part of our day. They're overly excited about showing that they have met their learning goals, and they want to share it with everyone. So what we've unlearned, the formative assessment process is not necessarily new to us. We have observed students, collected work samples, and taken notes in order to get to know our students and establish what they didn't know. And with the KEA, it helps us to get to know our students as well as to focus on what they know, what they are coming into kindergarten with, and having an understanding of that it helps me address their needs, and which in turn helps them to grow academically. So I'm also able to look at students in a different way. For example, if a student is low academically, and I have concerns about an assessment, or I feel like I need to begin interventions with them, I can use formative assessment as an opportunity to provide project-based learning or that center-based learning, those hands-on activities to help support the student. And since this is strengths-based, as stated before, my focus can be on what they know and going from there with planning and instruction. My teacher assistant has always been beneficial with collecting information about our students, and where not all kindergarten teachers have teacher assistants, I found that in our school we did, and in the past they were so beneficial at observing our students and collecting information and writing notes while we were busy teaching in isolation or assessing in isolation. So having the teacher assistants be involved in this KEA process just came naturally for me anyway in my classroom. So that was really a good benefit for me. There are some instances where a student can't get what the state says they should know, and this allows me to look in all areas of development and document where they are and where we need to go next. And sometimes it may be that they aren't able to learn if they're struggling with some social or emotional development in their life. If I observe a student that doesn't have a certain social skill or crossing the midline, then I know I need to offer opportunities, again, for those center-based learning. And if they aren't able to attend to text in my reading workshops or doing guided instruction, then I can set up in the task independently and not be afraid to take those risks to maybe rearrange the classroom or not have as many paper, pencil activities or worksheets, and not be afraid to let them work in centers or work in groups or work together. And I just encourage kindergarten teachers to not be afraid of the center-based learning and to use or adapt or modify situations so that they can collect the evidence that they need and the evidence that is meaningful. And to have those opportunities last summer I had an opportunity to participate with a staff development with another county, and a lot of the teachers expressed the need to buy new furniture or that they needed to revamp their entire classroom, whereas we had to help them realize that they already had the tools in place. They didn't have to make these drastic changes in order to just do what they do best, observe their students while they are working. And so after the first 60 days, also we found that teachers were uncomfortable with making the status summaries, that we found that it was important to remind them that the status summaries, it just depicts what teachers do, what the students are doing, and just an interpretation of where the child currently is along that construct progression. So what we've relearned in a sense is that assessment and instruction go hand in hand. During instruction, we have opportunities to see what skills students have acquired, provide documentation and support with this, and do some purposeful planning. Just utilize those small group instructions, those times where we have large group or work with individuals, and just to make it meaningful, to capture what is important for that child's learning. And it also helps to develop a growth mindset in our students and create a culture of them taking ownership of their own learning. I have a podium in my classroom, and my students take turns sharing their work. And it's just awesome to see them asking and answering questions and discussing how maybe they've learned something or realized that, for example, before they were counting objects by ones, and now they can group objects by fives or tens, and they no longer have to count them by one. And so just hearing students have that type of talk and having more kid talk versus teacher talk is really beneficial for the growth and development of our students. And just sharing all of this with parents has been a little struggle for me personally, but I just use the platform that we have and the parent reports and things that we can share with parents, and it's very self-explanatory, and it just gives them an idea of where their students are developmentally and not just according to an assessment and rubrics that all students are assessed on. So, are there any questions?
So, Kimberly, there are a couple questions in the chat box, and one of them relates to the topic you were just talking about families. And this question kind of goes in the other direction, which is not just info sharing with families, but also getting insights from families about how their kids are doing. So if you could talk about whether and how you account for that in your process.
Well, at the beginning of the school year, when we have parents come in for open house or parent meetings, we introduce the KEA process to them, and we let them know that we will be contacting them in order for us to gain information from them about their child, because they are the expert on their child. And we just normally have those one-on-one conferences at the beginning of the year, and we just share what we will be doing and the entire process, and just ask questions. And some years we've had a questionnaire that the kindergarten teachers developed in order to gain insight, and we just allow the parents to share with us what they feel is important, and just to give us an overview of their child.
That's great. Another question, Kimberly, that came up is from another Kimberly who wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the kids and choice time, the sort of your students and how you structure choice time into your overall schedule.
Well, there are certainly times where I have to schedule the centers and the activities, and then within that I try to maybe have one free choice activity. And it's still, with learning is still taking place, but our centers are structured so the students, the activities, the games, they feel like they're having fun, and they're still learning. They're working on either whatever skill they need to work on, but in their minds, they know I have a choice. I can choose. After I, do the work my teacher wants me to do, I can choose another activity. If it's doing literacy time, it's a literacy-based activity. Doing math or writing, then so on. It's based on those activities. And then I also provide a time where there's just free choice. There are centers set up, activities set up, and they know we've set up a standard where they can choose to go to a different activity if there's no more than 4 students there. So we set up some norms, some rules, and eventually the students will get accustomed to them. I don't have to repeat them. They're self-guided in their activities, and it may be Fun Friday, or it may be a rainy day where we can't go outside. Or I try to incorporate as much as I can activities that will allow them to do the self-selecting. Does that answer your question?
I don't see more chat from Kimberly, the other Kimberly, so hopefully that's good. Actually, no, Kimberly had another question, which is, would you say choice time is 60 minutes a day?
I don't actually put a time limit on choice time. I just have my literacy block, my math block, my writing block, and during those blocks, then I allow for choice time. I think we've had the flexibility to do that, but that may not always work in other classrooms. So it's important for teachers to plan their activities and to go about this in a way that's comfortable for them and what will work in their classroom with their students and in their school, in their own situation.
And then, Kimberly, one last question for you, and then we'll turn things over to Megan. But that question is to talk about intentional instruction around supporting social-emotional development and where you are with that in your process.
More is done with that at the beginning of the school year, per se, when students are coming in and their emotions are all over the place, and some of them haven't been in a school setting, or they haven't been around other children. So some of my activities are pre-planned just so I can get a feel for where my students are and what I may need to look for. And then I just take clues from the students. I just use my observations. I use situations that occur. And it may be that I only need to look for or plan for something for one student. So I really have to be intentional in planning that activity so I can look for that or work on those skills. Or it may be that I need to do it for a group of students, and that's a little easier because I don't have to put as much into the planning, but it's just based on what the students' needs are as far as the social and emotional development, and we just plan carefully and try to meet the needs of those students. And a lot of times it involves the parents, and I'm getting input from the parents and sharing information with them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. So we have one more community we're going to hear from, and Megan Scott is going to talk to us now about Oklahoma. So, Megan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Harriet. Hi. I am Megan Scott, the Program Coordinator for the Oklahoma Partnership for School Readiness. And today I just am going to talk a little bit about our experience planning a kindergarten entry assessment without the Early Learning Challenge grant, and give you a little bit of insight on the barriers that we have had in Oklahoma in regards to implementation, and which ultimately led us to really focusing on seriously incorporating our teacher voice into our KEA, which we call the Early Learning Inventory, and then also kind of talk about the importance of having public-private partnerships and collaborating when implementing a KEA. And so our organization, as Harriet says, serves as the State Early Childhood Advisory Council to the Governor. We are a public-private board, and our membership is made of state agency leaders and governor-appointed community volunteers. We worked closely with the Oklahoma State Department of Education in applying for the Early Learning Challenge grant, but unfortunately Oklahoma was not a grantee. And so the W.K. Kellogg Foundation approached us to assist us in meeting two of our goals from the ELC application, one which was to support the implementation of a robust early childhood integrated data system, and then the second goal was to facilitate the implementation of a KEA. The money wasn't as much as was provided with the ELC, but it allowed OPSR to provide 2 full-time employees devoted specifically to facilitating these 2 goals, and also opened doors for creating a closer partnership with the State Department of Education and the state superintendent, who's been very, very supportive of this work with us. While other states' KEA was implemented through their State Department of Education agencies, Oklahoma took kind of a unique public-private partnership approach to this issue that actually allowed us to be a bit more flexible about the way we approach teacher supports and our implementation. And so before I get into how OPSR and the Department of Ed went about supporting teachers and children while implementing a KEA, I would just want to give you a little background on assessment use in our state. Oklahoma has in state statute the Reading Sufficiency Act, which aims to ensure that all students are reading on grade level at the end of 3rd grade. And it requires that screening instruments are to be administered to all kindergarten through 3rd graders at the beginning and end of each year. And the instruments have to include phonemic awareness, phonics, reading fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. And there are currently 13 approved screeners, and this is the only assessment required by the State Department to be administered in kindergarten, although other districts may, and they usually do, require their teachers to use additional assessments throughout the year. And that really varies by district. We're very much a district choice state. Another complication for implementation is the Oklahoma budget. Our state per pupil funding has been cut 28% since 2008, and Oklahoma has seen a budget deficit of almost $1 billion every year for the last 2 legislative sessions, and we expect another one of at least $500 million this year. Additionally, like other states, Oklahoma is suffering from a teacher shortage and has had to increase its use of emergency teacher certification and become more lenient on classroom ratios. We also have a really strong tension between teachers and the Oklahoma legislature right now because the legislature has continued to fall short of a promise to provide teacher pay raises for the last 2 years. And so it's for these reasons that OPSR and Department of Education really wanted to ensure that we think critically and carefully about how we can best support teachers and children when implementing a comprehensive observational assessment. And so we decided to approach the idea by talking to those who could find a KEA the most useful and those most likely to push against the idea, which is teachers. So we worked with the State Department of Education and Lori Connors-Tedros with the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes, and Harriet Dichter provided immense support and insight for me. And we designed and disseminated an online survey to kindergarten and pre-K teachers across the state in 2016. And the survey asked about teachers' current classroom, the assessments they use, the skills they felt were necessary to succeed in kindergarten. And we followed the surveys up with a round of focus groups late that same year and probed deeper into the type of assessment we should be using for a KEA and the supports teachers need, as well as the skills teachers should be measuring, how the information should be used, and what reports should look like and contain. Our first round of surveys in January 2016 included a little over 1,000 responses. And when we presented our initial results to the state superintendent, she felt we were missing a voice from a couple of districts that were really important to getting a complete picture of teachers in Oklahoma. And so she offered to have her staff send out the survey again in May that same year from her email address, and that doubled the response rate. And so her push really increased our response from 36% of districts to 92% of districts being represented. We had, at that time, over 2,000 pre-K teachers in 2016 and 2,800 kindergarten teachers. So the response was about 44% in both groups. We also later on conducted 5 focus groups 7 months later, totaling 100 participants, including teachers, higher education representatives, Head Start, child care providers, school administrators, parents, and community members. I'm just going to review a few of those results because it's quite an expansive amount of data, but you can see a presentation of both the surveys and the focus groups on our website at opsrfoundation.org, and just click Early Learning Inventory at the top. So what we learned was that teachers reported that assessment is useful and important for informing instruction, particularly when they receive a wide range of professional development opportunities to support its use. Specifically, they've expressed a need for assessments in domains of math, social, emotional, and physical development. And these are domains that are not currently required by the State Department of Education, but we all know that they're very important for academic success. We also found that teachers think that there's a significant advantage for students who attend pre-K over those who do not, and a comprehensive assessment would allow them to tailor instruction to meet the needs of all their students. More than 70% of our 4-year-olds were enrolled in pre-K during that year, so we have 30% of children that come from a variety of early childhood experiences. Teachers also really felt strongly about that parent involvement, and it's key to a child's success in school. What we unlearned is that teachers are assessing more than just what is required for the Reading Sufficiency Act. In focus groups, some teachers stated they were using 5 different assessments because of state and district requirements, but also to inform their own instruction. So they're assessing more times, often by choice. We found that pre-K and kindergarten teachers were assessing about 5 or more times a year. What we also found that time is an even bigger issue than we thought it would be. Less than 30% of kindergarten teachers that year had an assistant. It's probably lower now due to budget cuts, and the average class for both classes was 21, but they're spending 10 to 20 minutes per student assessing. And while the average number of students on an IEP for both classes was 2, kindergarten teachers were more likely to have more students on an IEP than pre-K. Having never taught in a classroom myself, I had no idea the amount of time teachers spent on assessment, particularly assessments they find to be important but not necessarily required. And we found that teachers really, really do value assessment, but they just don't have that time to complete the paperwork or use the reports effectively. So shortly after our surveys were done, the State Department of Education and OPSR formed a steering committee made of teachers, staff from both organizations, higher education individuals, and we used our survey information and conducted focus groups and took everything we learned to create a mission statement for our KEA. And so the early learning inventory focuses on ensuring a child's success in school by informing educators on how to support classroom instruction and providing information to guide families, educators, community partners, and policymakers in making decisions on how to enhance and differentiate early learning opportunities. Most importantly, we ensured that we added that the inventory is not to be used as a high-stakes tool to prevent entry into kindergarten, identify students for special education eligibility, and evaluate programs or teachers. When implementing an ELI, we decided that it needed to include a few things specifically: a variety of professional development and continuing education opportunities, teacher supports including coaching, substitutes, paid travel, a very clear purpose, time, which I don't know that we've still figured that out. I don't think anybody has, but family engagement and consistency in implementation, and include it in the Reading Sufficiency Act standards. We used all the data we collected to design a feasibility study that we started last August for the school year to explore the costs, the human resources, the administrative and teacher supports we would need to implement a statewide early learning inventory. And so how the results from our focus groups and surveys informed this study were through model selection. This study, Teaching Strategies Gold, and Pearson Work Sampling System were chosen by the steering committee because it met all the requirements that the assessment aligned with existing Oklahoma academic standards, addresses the 5 domains of development via valid online observational assessment. Another concern echoed by teachers was needing parent reports in the parent's native language. And although those tools meet some of those teachers' concerns, it doesn't meet all of them. And so I think in our next steps, we will need to think about how we meet that concern teachers had about parent engagement, as that was a major issue reflected in both the survey and in the focus groups. The additional supports that we provided were 2-day face-to-face professional development on observational assessment and on the online system. We paid for substitutes and their travel and hotels if they were driving for more than an hour. And then we provided on-demand coaching via phone, email, or face-to-face through a staff member at the Department of Education, Sharon Morgan, who we appreciate greatly, as well as one of our own staff member at OPSR, Diane Bell. We provided access to free online professional development through Pearson and Teaching Strategies, and then we also had an online faculty forum to foster collaborative learning and provide online support. Our study began in September. We had our professional development then. We ended our first checkpoint in November and just ended a survey of teachers and administrators. And we will be conducting focus groups and interviews the next 2 to 3 months so we can continuously reflect their voice and their concerns throughout the process of planning a statewide assessment. And I can take questions now.
Thank you, Megan. So Heather had a question for you actually about the data system work you're doing. And she wanted to know who are the data partners, and also within the data system that's being developed, whether child outcomes will be able to be included.
Okay. Our data work is really interesting, not just because it's my project, but we are actually working through the Health and Human Services Cabinet in our state, who has formed a shared services solution or group, committee, I guess you could say, and they're creating an integrated data system which will actually be a child and adolescent record. And that group includes our Health and Human Service, our Department of Health, our Department of Human Services, our state Medicaid agency. We've got Rehab, Juvenile Affairs, and then also we have Department of Education. As whether child outcomes will be included, we are working on a test case specifically to look at kind of a distinct count of what services children are using. it will be, just to clarify, this will be an aggregate system, so we will not be looking at singular, child level data. And so it's very, very beginning stages of being built and designing those reports. And so child outcomes as it pertains to what administrative data can tell us will be part of that.
Thank you, Megan. And then we have a question for all the speakers from Paula Gilbert. Paula is asking this question. Do any of the programs locally or at the state level work with public libraries to provide support to families and teachers as well? And she's asking especially in the transition period, but also any other kind of support that's related to our conversation around kindergarten assessment, kindergarten teaching, the whole totality of the kindergarten experience. So thoughts from our speakers? Anyone have strategies that you're working on with your library system that you want to share?
This is Megan. Paula, you and I are like kindred spirits because I've been all about the libraries the past couple of weeks. So we don't have one with libraries, but I am like you. I feel like that's a very important resource that we are not reaching. We do have on our board is Department of Libraries Director, and so I think that's something that schools and districts and state agencies should be really considering is how best we can partner with those public libraries because they reach so many people in the community that you may not touch in any other way. And so no, we don't, but I think that we would like to, and I think that it's been a little bit of a conversation that we've had just in the last week in my organization.
Thank you, Megan. Any of the rest of the speakers want to comment on this?
This is Vincent.
Vincent, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, similarly, we did not have at the state level, and I don't believe that there is one now with regard to early learning, a major statewide partnership with with libraries. It's always, again, something we talk about, but, unfortunately something underutilized. And I think at times this is an element where we remind districts that they look for local control. So this would be an opportunity for them to go and seek it and look on the local level. So I think there are some pockets of where that actually works, but anything that I would consider system-wide that was really, part of a statewide initiative, I would say I don't have examples of that. So it would be mostly on the local level.
Thank you, Vincent. Megan, Bobby has another question for you that goes back to the focus groups you did. And she was thinking about the issue that you raised around the teachers telling you that the time to perform the assessments is meaningful, and I think we heard about that from other speakers as well. She was wondering in the focus group whether there was conversation occurring about the value of authentic observation-based assessment and how that is playing out. And that actually may also be a question that others also want to address. But Megan, do you want to start in thinking about this question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that was talked about. They do value it, and I think just having gone through the professional development with the teachers in our study is that the conversation has been a lot of, well, I don't have time, And so I think part of the way that we thought, or the part of the way that our trainers specifically talked about time, which was great, was take it one bite at a time, but also ask your principal and ask your superintendent for help. It's the worst they can say is no. And so, and we continued to encourage that when teachers reached out to us about time concerns, about not having time to fill in the questionnaire as an issue. And so they all value the assessment, the authentic assessment in particular. And I think that when we implement this statewide, our recommendations will be that this needs to be a priority of not just teachers and parents, but also of the principals and the superintendents, and really thinking about how they can work collaboratively together to do this assessment and come up with ways. Maybe it includes, having a coach or having a teacher's assistant or having another teacher just kind of help them. And so that, yeah, absolutely, that was talked about a lot.
Thank you, Megan. Anyone else want to comment on this question?
Yes, this is Lizette from. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Go ahead, Lizette.
Okay, so my thoughts on time. The teachers here in West New York also struggled in the beginning with having sufficient time to be able to enter in all of their documentations. And I think that overall the issue of time comes from a lack of integration of the assessments, of the curriculum, of the standards. The teachers are trying to do each component in isolation, therefore it's taking them additional time because they're looking at it as separate components. But as we work with the teachers to integrate everything, they're able to put together an approach to assessment. Something to consider is having assessment detailed in their lesson plans and being able to plan purposely with what objectives are going to be done in a day, how many students, and starting to look at it from a more planned approach.
Thanks, Lizette. Kimberly, did you want to join in here?
Yes, I was just going to add that it was important for us to remind teachers that they could also use information gained from the mandatory assessments that we were required to give, and we didn't have to do one more thing, or it wasn't that we had to give another assessment just to gain this information. So with some of the reading and math assessments that we were already implementing, we can make observations during those or use that information as documentation. And we also used our EC teachers, our exceptional children's teachers, and just teachers throughout the entire school that would give us information. And a lot of times it would be helpful because they would see something that we didn't observe or didn't capture, and it turned out to be valuable information.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. So we're coming to the end of our webinar, and I'm hoping that everyone has learned a lot and is going to be able to use this information from our really wonderful speakers to inform your own next steps and your own work in this area. I did promise the speakers that if we had time permitting, that each of them could offer a final insight or thought before we close out the webinar. So I would like to be able to do that now. And we'll just go through in the speaker order. So Vincent, we'll start with you, and then we'll hear from Lizette, and then from Kimberly, and finally from Megan. So Vincent, what are your final thoughts for us for the day?
Sure, and thanks so much again, Harriet and Bill, for organizing this, and to all the speakers. Hopefully everybody learned as much from the things that I was talking about as I did from everybody else, as I certainly learned a lot. I would offer 3 items from my remarks. Number 1, partnerships matter. This work is too difficult. You cannot do it alone. You need strong partnerships with state agencies, with outside agencies, as well as with school districts. Number 2, when you're doing kindergarten entry assessment, it cannot be just about assessment. You might have noticed this is not a great time to talk about, hey, let's do some more assessment with young children. That's a great idea. It's kind of an anxious assessment time. So really what needs to be focused on is best practices. That, by the way, assessment is a very important piece of that. Data on the child level as well as on the program level is very important. KEA needs to be about practices in order to get to good data. And then lastly, systems matter. Unless you're engaging different levels of the system, teacher level, building level leadership, district level leadership. You're really going to, I don't think you're going to be solving the time issue that was so clear in the Oklahoma example, and I think, as was talked about, really focusing on different levels of the system is the approach to do that. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Vincent. Lizette, how do you want to end the day for our webinar?
Certainly. Well, what I've learned through this process is really the importance of stakeholders to define a clear vision, to set their goals, and to work collaboratively to achieve these goals. Always stopping to reflect and have good conversations with all staff involved, and that change is not a destination, but really a process, and it's always evolving. It's important to celebrate the successes along the way and have good, meaningful conversations with the teachers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lizette. Kimberly, how about you?
Yes. So I would just say, remember that the kindergarten entry assessment, along with the technology platform, gives us an organized way to be able to share a developmental learning profile for each individual student. Each student will have their own portfolio filled with documentation of learning that includes work samples, photos, videos, anecdotal notes, and this is not only beneficial after they enter kindergarten, but it's also beneficial to have at the end of the kindergarten year to show each individual child's pathway of learning. And thank you for participating today.
Thank you. Megan?
I think Vincent and everyone else kind of reflected greatly on what the entire conversation was about, and I think the one takeaway is probably work with those partners that you would not think of working with. We have a good, strong university partner, and we are a strong partner with the Department of Education, and they are a strong partner with us. But also with your local teachers and your districts and your local nonprofits that also have interactions with those communities to really kind of push that whole child approach in learning and teaching.
Thank you so much. So as we close, I again want to thank our speakers. They took a lot of time in advance of today's webinar to really think through what they felt were their key learnings and key points that would be best to share with our national audience. And so I appreciate all their time and effort and obviously the really good work they're doing in their home communities. And again, I want to thank everyone who participated with us and especially people who put your questions into the chat box today. As you all know, this is part of a series, so we are going to have another webinar in this series that will be about a month from now on Monday, February 5th. We're still planning to do it at 3:30, and we're going to have a focus exclusively on infants and toddlers at our next webinar, so I hope people will consider joining us. I do see, as I'm getting ready to say goodbye, that Kim wants to know if we can put the link for the next webinar in the chat. Jen Bender hopefully can do that, and if not, Kim, we will be broadcasting and having registration as well separately so that we'll be able to reach all of you. So thank you for spending this first Monday in January with us to talk about kindergarten. We're appreciative of all your leadership and good work, and I hope everyone has a fantastic afternoon. Thank you so much. Bye now.